welcome to this week's book club episode for Star Wars Catalyst by James Luceno. If you're not familiar with this series, we will be looking at this book a couple of chapters at a time, really diving into the themes and happenings that's going on. You'll be able to find a link to this full playlist in the description or in one of the cards above, as well as a link to our other playlists for other books we've done in this series in the description. But today we're going to discuss chapters 6, 7, and 8. Let's go ahead and talk about chapter 6. Chapter 6 was called Bonding. Now, the superficial meaning of bonding is Lyra is spending time with Jen. So we see mother and daughter kind of starting to connect. But this chapter is also largely kind of an origin of how Lyra met Galen, how Galen got to know Orson, and how all of that kind of comes into play. We learn in this novel that Lyra believes in the Force and she can feel it but can't use it, which is something we would also understand from the film as well. Of course, this book came out before the film, so it would have been backstory for anybody kind of going into the movie. And she believes that no government will overcome the evil in the galaxy, only the Force. So she's it kind of explains her, she probably prefers the Republic to other forms of government just because she probably prefers democracy, but she's really not waiting around for a government solution to anything. She believes the Force will find its own balance. She has a positive view of the Jedi. And then we learn of Galen's rise to prominence and how, like I said, how he meets Orson. That Galen has these humble beginnings. His parents weren't super rich or anything, but his mother was a teacher, recognized his genius, and they found ways to kind of get him educated beyond the level he would be in their kind of nowhere home, and then get him to Coruscant and into better classes. This is a thing with Luceno's writing style. It's very well written. I can see, especially if you're a big Galen Erso fan, why you would enjoy how this is written, but it's just it's kind of like carving a marble statue of these characters. Like, whenever Luceno talks about one of the Ursos, he's like, and then Galen was so smart that he figured out how the abacus worked at 6 months old, and then and just by the sheer goodness of his character, he learned physics. And it read a little bit like that to me. But mostly, I'm just frustrated because I just wish that James Luceno loved Krennic as much as he loves Galen. And that's mostly because I love Krennic in many, many ways, in lots of ways. And I would like long diatribes of how wonderful Krennic is. But then we learn, as the story goes, Lyra describes how Galen always liked Orson Krennic. Then, though they were opposites, Krennic was the loud, boisterous guy. He was always with friends or women. He was protecting Galen when they were in school. And she wonders if Galen is right to trust Krennic, or if they actually need him, right? There's a part of her that doesn't really trust Krennic, but she wants to trust her husband. And then there's the part of her that realizes that Krennic might be who they need right now, even if she doesn't like that. Chapter 7 is called Enthralled to Grand Ideas. And this starts with Galen and Lyra, and they're trying to figure out what they're going to do. They came back, they don't have work, they have to support themselves and a child. The galaxy is different, their home is different, and they're trying to come up with a plan. Galen is still wrestling with guilt over what happened on Vault to his friends and his family. He also feels like he owes Orson, which makes Lyra concerned because she doesn't want him to go work for the war. And Galen says, no, I have a much better idea. I'm going to rescue Orson. And for myself, I usually refer to Orson Krennic as Krennic, but it becomes easier to call him, Orson when discussing this book because the Ursos think of him as Orson, so I kind of go back and forth between the two names. I apologize if that's confusing. But it's interesting that Galen would feel... What Galen's going through is interesting to me because he's going through this sense of guilt, but also this sense of distrust. He feels like he owes Krennic for saving him and because of their friendship, but he also thinks Krennic is doing something wrong. And so then he comes up with this grand scheme, which I'll go ahead and skip ahead a little bit because it was in this week's reading. But, he wants to save Krennic from the war by pulling him into, their own kind of private venture, which is intriguing to me, is this idea that he would pull him into a business proposition. He really doesn't see what's going on. And it's interesting to see things Galen's way, because it's not necessarily how I would have seen them, and Lucino does an effective job of, like, getting you through the Urso's eyes, I think. It helps a lot, too, that Galen is often translated by Lyra. And so you're able to understand what's going on in Galen's mind because there's a character explaining Galen's mind, and it makes sense that she's there to explain Galen's mind. Then we jump over to Krennic. Krennic is still trying to get Galen to work on the super weapon as a part of what will one day be called the Death Star. But he describes how this has to be Galen's idea. Right, he can't convince or trick Galen into this, so he's having to take this really slow. And then Krennic goes to talk to Poggle the Lesser, and so this connects with Clone Wars. So the second battle of Geonosis is the Geonosis arc in Season 2 of the Clone Wars, and so this is after that. In fact, there's an episode somewhere along in there, I can't remember if it's actually in the Geonosis arc, but it's Anakin, I believe, and trying to mind control Poggle into giving information. I think that's how that episode goes. But either way, it's after the second battle of Geonosis that we see in the show, and he tries to get information about the Death Star out of him. And what was cool about this chapter is it's really good to see Krennic succeeding, I guess. So much of what we would go on to see in Rogue One is Krennic always falling short of where Tarkin is. And I mean, that makes sense. Tarkin is more shrewd than Krennic. If I'm remembering correctly, we will get to some more with Tarkin in this novel. So I'll kind of save a lot of this discussion for later on in the story. If you're kind of looking at your Imperial bureaucrats, in my opinion, in my interpretation, Krennic wants power because he wants fame. And to the extent that Tarkin would want fame, it's because it would help him to accumulate power, and that's kind of the difference between the two. It's good to see Krennic can actually, because he is one of my favorite Star Wars villains, it's fun for me to see him actually being very successful at all of his machinations, because we see him get outmatched by Tarkin, but, seeing somebody get outmatched by Tarkin is like seeing a Force user get outmatched by Darth Vader. Like, obviously they're you're getting outmatched by the top of the top. The fact that you're somebody who can tangle it all with Tarkin says a lot. And so it's good to kind of see Krennic in his element, to see what he can and can't do, and to see how well he plays Poggle, talking about how busy Geonosian is a happy Geonosian, and the kind of hive mind mentality of Geonosians, and how Poggle is actually on the verge of losing control of his people. And he kind of cares about that more than he cares about any separatist movement. So Krennic is able to kind of get through to Poggle and get Poggle to tell him what he wants and do what he wants, which is largely just to get manual labor for the Death Star, or the soon-to-be Death Star. After this, we see Krennic on his way to go talk to Galen, and Krennic is already kind of working out in his head. Like, he's sure Galen is coming to talk to him about a job, and he's like, I will refuse to give Galen a job at first, but then I'll go ahead and say that I'll do it because of this motivation. And we're saying how he's already kind of playing this out. But Krennic kind of has that same blind spot that so many Star Wars villains have, especially Imperial Star Wars villains have, that especially the Emperor has, which is they fail to kind of see purity of the heart. They kind of operate under the assumption that everybody is as terrible as they are. Orson is like, well, obviously Galen's going to come ask for a job. He can't conceive of the idea that Galen would offer him a job. And he's completely flabbergasted at the idea of accepting. And that whole conversation was interesting because they're literally trying to convince each other. Orson's like, hey, join me on this project. And Galen's like, no, let's go into business together. After that, Galen goes to get lunch with his former mentor, who is surprised that he hasn't signed up. She actually probably starts saying more than she should before she realizes that he hasn't taken any kind of secrecy oaths yet. She says that he might want to think about it because he might need a plan, that the galaxy is shifting and things are happening, and he might find himself without any kind of foundation if he doesn't actually pick a side. But the conversation ends with her inviting him to a reunion that's probably going to be a goodbye for all the people who kind of went to school in this like futures super ultra honors program that they were all in. So this chapter, like I said, was called In Thrall of Grand Ideas, and I thought that was a good chapter title for what's going on, because, you know, you start with Galen and his grand idea to go into business with, or science business with Orson, and Orson is like, no, I'm finally getting Galen to join me, and you know, he's trying to work with Orson. Krennic is trying to work with Poggle, and it was just a series of POVs about people who are basically like under the sway of these grand ideas they have, either of going into science business or getting Galen to work on the weapon, or, you know, keeping your rule and your reign as Archduke of the Geonosians. And that was just kind of, this was really kind of that aspirational chapter. Like, we started with bonding, learning how everyone met. This is kind of like what everyone's up to right now, and this is what everyone wants. And then the next chapter, chapter 8, Public Displays of Affection, is going to be a lot more of like, well, this is how things are. So it starts out with Krennic talking to Mas Ameda, who is a very regular occurrence in James Luceno novels. Honestly, James Luceno ever writes another canon Star Wars novel, I would love to see him just write a Mas Ameda novel. That's something I've talked about with Professor Django on here quite a bit. Something I think it would be really good to like connect a story about Mas from this old Republic time all the way through to the time of the Aftermath trilogy, and somebody who could really track what Palpatine's been up to. Here, in this part, Mas and Krennic are talking, and Mas is kind of, I mean, he's stuck between two things. You know, he is annoyed at Krennic for his initiative, that Krennic offered something to Poggle that he hasn't gotten Galen yet, and yet he can't really argue with the results. Like, yeah, Krennic went out of line probably to get Poggle to do what he was doing, to promise Poggle what he promised Poggle, but he got Poggle and he got the Geonosians on board, and Krennic is able to use like this fishing metaphor to convince him as to why it's not too late to get Galen. And so he's kind of going back and forth between being annoyed but also kind of understanding what it is Krennic is doing. Just from a backdrop kind of thing, it wouldn't be a Luceno novel without an absurd amount of references. We get name drops like Loch Durd and Neurovendi, who are both, I believe they're both season 1 villains from Star Wars The Clone Wars. Neurovendi is from the Blue Shadow Iris, and Loch Durd was on the Lemur planet. Mentioning that they could have been used in a prisoner exchange just tells us again kind of where we are in the Clone Wars timeline, and just connects to what's going on. At the time Catalyst was released, we didn't have a whole lot of extra material in the prequels outside of the Clone Wars, so it was largely the only thing Luceno could reference, and he put some good references in there. There's also talks about the losses at Ryloth and Bathui, which would also be episodes. Bathui is the planet where they had the ATTEs, the clone walkers, and they were on the asteroids, and they like came up and flanked the ships. And then the loss over Ryloth, I'm assuming that meant Ahsoka's loss over Ryloth, because Mace is ultimately able to take back Ryloth. So where those references must be referencing a very specific portion of like season 2 of Clone Wars. We must be in the middle of a couple of things, because they were talking about losses that I didn't remember, and I could just not be remembering them as losses, but it also could just be where they are in the stage of that battle isn't along yet, or I could just be getting my episodes crossed. I did watch all the episodes, but like I was on season 2 like a year ago, so I might just not be remembering. But as they continue to have this conversation, Mas and Krennic, Ameda talks about how, you know, he doesn't really like people with principles, and he wonders if Galen's going to be worth it, and he's confused why he has this wife who's just there to translate, and it's clear that both Ameda and Krennic underestimate Lyra quite a bit and don't really understand what's going on there. But then we jump to the party, and the party, we're in Krennic's point of view. He wasn't even going to go to the party until he heard that the Ursos were going. He starts by seeing Lyra like actually dressed up, which was something he was surprised about. You know, he's shocked that their marriage even still happened, because it just was never, women were never a thing that Galen seemed interested in, or relationships in general. But then at the party, somebody accuses Galen of basically spilling secrets to the Separatists and being against the Republic. This guy's drunk, but he goes up and levies some pretty heavy accusations against Galen. Galen ends up throwing a punch and doing so very effectively. Krennic, you know, kind of thinks about how he was Galen's protector, makes a comment about how Galen doesn't need it anymore. Galen makes a comment where it seems like maybe he was always just letting Krennic take care of him, which again kind of shows this strange friendship they had, where Galen, who seems so good at kind of like picking out good people or being suspicious when he needs to be, has just always trusted Krennic, which is especially strange if he never needed Krennic at any point in time. But it does show that at least in Galen's mind, there's a real friendship there, which is what makes it all the more tragic, the way Krennic abuses him. Especially because the chapter ends with him thinking that this party couldn't have played into his hands any better if he tried. That Galen's pride and sense of ethics have been attacked in front of everybody. And this is something that's going to cause Galen to start thinking and wondering if maybe he's doing the wrong thing after all. But that was Chapter 8, Public Displays of Affection. Obviously, the public displays of affection part is a little bit sarcastic, but it's just Krennic working with Ameda to gain some public displays of maybe honor and respect. And then, of course, Galen being accused in front of a party. For the next time we meet, let's read chapters 9, 10, and 11. We're going to do another 3-chapter bit. It's going to be another kind of longer chunk of change than I would normally want to do. But there's 2 reasons for that. One, I'm trying to end part 1 smoothly. So it's going to be 3 chapters, and then the time after that 2 chapters, and then we'll be on to part 2. So we're making really good distance into this. But the other reason is I'm not going to do a video next week. So there's the video this week, no video next week. The week after that, I will be back. So in 2 weeks, we will discuss chapters 9, 10, and 11. The reason for that is I'm going to be away from my computer I won't be able to make the video for next week. I'm taking a little bit of no technology time, which I'm very excited about. So if you're watching these videos on a binge after the fact, this won't mean anything to you because the next video is probably already there because you're in the future. But if you're watching these videos as they come out, I'm sorry, but we're going to be taking a break, and I will see you guys in 2 weeks. But other than that, if you're not already, please follow us on the socials. Always happy to talk to you guys any place I can. Discord especially is a good place to catch me if you really want to have a more in-depth Star Wars conversation. And with that, I'll talk to you guys in 2 weeks.